So because Derren is who he is, he has asked for an extra category in the sense area. So we had the 5 senses, but the category that you wanted to add in is the 6th sense. Ooh, spooky.
That is not a toy. That is not a toy, doing that with your fingers. Don't mess around with that stuff. Don't.
Am I summoning stuff
Don't
when I do
it on
that?
me. Yeah.
I'll be very careful. So of the 6 senses, 6th sense experiences, the first one you wanted to talk about was the sense of losing oneself in an environment. Yes.
So there's a bench that there's sort of some woods where I live, and there's a bench that if you go and sit there, well, I go and sit there, but if one goes and sits there, you kind of it takes a couple of minutes, but you really lose yourself in the environment, and it's something to do with the kind of the you're looking sort of down through, there's a bit of distance in what you're looking through. It's maybe something to do with the space, but you start to key into the movement of, there's some couple of wasps over here, or a moth doing this, and there's the sound of the birds, and there's the general sort of things, like the world just changes. Things kind of become alive. It's a little hard to explain unless you've sort of done it. It's not a dramatic thing. It's just that sort of present moment, experiencing time a little more deeply and immediately. So it's become a sort of quite a sort of a meditative spot. But I think the key to it is, and it slightly ties in with the second one, which we'll get to, is that, and I think this is also particularly useful with the environment, in terms of environmental issues, is that what we often do in life is we take things that are actually very complex and active and nuanced, and are more like verbs in the sense that they're doing things, and we call them by big noun names. So love, the environment, happiness, success. Those are all things that are actually the things that we do, right? Even the sense of self, like who we are, is really something that's very active, and it changes depending where we are and who we're with. It's a fluid thing. All these things are really better seen as verbs. And when we do that with things like love, for example, we see that as something that, no, it's actually something we are involved with and create and have to sustain. In some ways, it can be a bit like a job. It's not just, because when you do see it as a big noun, we can park it, and we start to see it as perhaps something we're entitled to having, or an easy kind of something we can separate ourselves from. And the environment's a great example of this, because when we think of the environment, at least I do, often it's a sort of a thing that's kind of out there somewhere. It's glaciers, and it's forests, and it's not the air that is moving around my tongue as I speak and is pressing against my skin. And it isn't the moths and the wasps and these things that are right around me now on the ground that I'm moving on. And the only difference between seeing it as something that you can kind of take or leave and seeing it as something that actually is something you are actively involved in, is really that shift between a sort of a noun and a verb. And this sort of experience I'm describing of settling into it as a kind of an activity. And there's a sort of present mindedness to that, a sort of a mindfulness to it, I guess. So I think it's important. I think it's important not just with the environment. I think it's important with love. It's important with relationships. It's important with, growing up is about tolerating ambiguity. And the more we can sort of pull apart these big, easy nouns in our life and see it as something that these things as we are involved actively in sustaining and creating them from day to day. I think there's a lot to benefit from there. But that particular experience is quite a visceral one for me. And I'm not someone that meditates particularly, but it's a very pleasant meditative experience. So yeah, it stands out for me.
And that leads into the second one, which is your sense of wonder.
The sense of wonder. So it's interesting to me because, excuse me, magicians are supposed to give you that. That's supposed to be what magic does. And of course, it sort of tends not to. There's an old, I say an old, there's a great magician, who, not old at all, called Paul Harris, who sort of had this idea that magic takes us back to a childlike state of wonder, that when we're born, the world is, everything is new, we're experiencing it for the first time, and gradually, bit by bit, we get familiar with things, and we lose bit by bit these little pockets of wonder, and then magic takes us back to that, which is a lovely idea. But if the magician you're watching just has bad breath or is rude or not very good, you're not experiencing wonder at all. You're probably just experiencing irritation or embarrassment. And if you make out that a thing is inherently important, you are kind of taking the responsibility off the performer to make it important, right? So I don't quite go with that idea. And I think magic's probably quite bad at supplying it. So then, where does it come from? And I think it does come from this experience of letting things open up. And so one of the interesting things that magic does do, which I think is of value, is it makes you realize that your story of the world is not reality, right? We tend to walk around mistaking our field of vision for the horizons of the world, right? And a magician doing a trick half decently is going to make you realize, oh, well, there's my story, but other stuff must have happened. Other stuff must be, I've excluded. And of course, we do this all the time. We have this infinite data source coming at us. So we have to pick and choose to make sense of it, to navigate through the world. And we do that by making up a story. And then we live that story and we mistake it for the truth. And we forget that there's all this other stuff. The very notion of a story is like, it's that image of a campfire, isn't it? Like a cozy story told around a fire. And then you've got outside of you all the dark forest, or where all the monsters live, that's excluded from the coziness of this here. And whether that's our like shadow sides that don't fit into the story of ourselves that we kind of banish, or whether it's things in life, the story of how we think life should be, and all the stuff we don't want to include in the story that makes us feel cozy and comfortable in there. They banish into the forest, and those are the monsters that come back and bite us, because the things we're unconscious of are the things that gain power and energy in our lives. So I think the feeling of wonder sort of comes somewhere in that process. And it's a bit like slipping into the environment or those things as an active thing. It's just allowing things to open up into these more complex and nuanced experiences, and not just packing them off, labeling them and packing them off where we can just take them or leave them. I think that's somewhere where the experience of wonder comes from. And it's a wonderful thing, whether you do get it from a great magic trick. I have done. I've had moments that really make me gasp. Or whether
can you remember the last time that happened to you? The last one that was like, wow.
I think actually in a magic show, I said it very rarely happens. I think what always comes to mind is Penn and Teller, the American duo, a show in Vegas, and Teller has a particular trick with a and fans of them will know it. I think it's called Silverfish, but it's a classic plotting magic called Mizer's Dream, where you're producing coins one at a time and normally dropping them into a bucket is classically how it's done. And he does it with a big tank of water. It's a fish tank. And he's reaching in and pulling out large coins from just a big tank of water, which probably doesn't sound much in the description, but when he first does it, it's jaw-dropping, and then he finds beautiful ways, this is Teller doing it, of making that surprising and entertaining and just brilliant. It's a phenomenal piece. But I watched that with a friend of mine who's Andy Nyman, who's been a close colleague and a very gifted magician himself, and we both just jaws hit the floor. So occasionally from my own sort of job, but otherwise it's just those moments of things opening up, isn't it? Gratitude and compassion tend to do it when we sort of settle into those a bit. They tend to have that sort of that effect. So yeah, they're good things to foster. So yeah, feeling of wonder, but I don't think it comes from magic very often.
And finally, then, the sense of inner congruity when we sometimes hit when we know we're at our best.
Yeah. So I think there's way too much emphasis on self-esteem. It just doesn't seem to me to be that important. I think to me, what's the important thing to sort of aim for, and the most realistically, I think we can hope for, and we should be, feel happy with, is a sense of inner congruity. So a sense of gathering ourselves together in a way that feels solid and fits nicely within itself, and then to be able to bring that out into the world and out into the relationships we're in. So there's a kind of a slightly stoic thing where your center of gravity has been pulled within, and quite an unstoic idea of it being then of that reaching back out. So an open sense of fluidity. There's a stoic image of like, you're like a rock and the waves are lashing against you, but a nicer image is like a porous rock that the waves can sort of maybe move through. And that's few and far between. We really kind of get the sense of gathering ourselves together and then meeting the world afresh, really. I suppose it's just that. And I don't think that gets enough PR. I think
is it the same, would you say, as because there was a book I was reading recently about being in the zone and talk about Navy SEALs, and when they go into, like, when they're going into battle or whatever it is, whatever operation on, there's moments where they're in the flow just happens.
Yeah.
And there's 4 of them in the team, and at any point one of them becomes the leader, and they don't talk about it, they just know who is the leader at that moment, and they just follow and they go, and it goes through into actors and musicians, and it's I think it's called the flow, if I remember rightly. Is it the same sort of thing?
Yeah, so that's a study by a guy called Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, and he calls it flow, and his notion is that regardless of whether you're acting or surfing or playing chess or whatever your thing is, there's a sort of experience that people share, that when you kind of lose a sense of time, you kind of feel that you're at your best, even though you're not necessarily happy. It's not about necessarily joy. And he pictures it as when your talents, or when your skills, if they're on one line of a graph, and you've got the challenges that you're facing here, when they sort of meet. So when you're in sort of like on an X equals Y, sort of in the middle, because if the challenges are outweighing your skills, you're going to get anxious. And if your skills outweigh the challenges you're facing, you're going to get bored. But when we hit it in the middle, we're in this sort of flow state, as he calls it. And this seems to be something that could be common to really any kind of activity. Now, I like that very much because, and it is similar to what I'm talking about, but I think there's a wider thing there, which is how we move through life. So if you take it not just as the particular activity, but here are our things in life that we wish to do. Here are our aims and our hopes. And then here is fortune. Here's all the stuff that life is throwing back at us, right? Now, what we're told is, if you believe in yourself enough and set your goals enough and have high self-esteem and blah, 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 you can crank the line that you live up so it's right in line with what your aims are and the things you want to achieve. And fortune and fate, none of that exists. The universe will sort of bend to your will if only you commit yourself enough. And it's a bit like watching a faith healer tell somebody, throw your pills away. And if that disease comes back, it's because you didn't have enough faith. It puts all the blame. It's a faith model, and it puts all the blame on that person. No blame on the system. The system is faultless. It's your fault. So the Stoic model is to go, no, actually, we live an X equals Y line. We sort of meander around it. So sometimes we are on top and things are going well, and sometimes things happen out the blue, life goes pear-shaped, and sometimes fortune is on top. So actually what you want to do is move in an easier accordance with that. And the way they say to do it is not try and control things that you can't. Just focus on your thoughts and your actions and all the other stuff, what other people do and what they think. Bryan Cranston talks about this actually with auditions. He said that, you know it, you've come across it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it's a great clip. He doesn't describe it as a Stoic thing, but I wouldn't be surprised if his it's come across Stoic thought. He said your job in an audition is not to get the job, right? That's the bit that's not under your control. Your job is to present the text in a compelling way and so on, and basically do your best. But then if it's someone else's role in the end, that's no more yours, or a sense of resentment than finding someone's wallet and going, oh, sorry, that's yours, and handing it back to them. And he said he's never worked as much since he made that decision. So we got slightly off topic there, but I that sense of moving in easier accordance with fate is important. But I do think, as a good starting point, gathering our center of gravity within that sense of like inner kind of cohesion, a feeling like we're at our best, and we all know what that feeling is for us, and we'll find it in different ways. And then, excuse me, I'm losing my mic. And then taking that then out into the world, and that's also really important. The trouble with some of the Stoic philosophies that can end up feeling like, well, this is great if you're on your own, but then how do you deal with the actual real life relationships that you're in? So I think that's the important part of it too. I think this is what we should be aiming for in life, not self-esteem, whatever that even means.
Well, I'm going to wrap it up there because I think you know, I'm going to flatter you slightly, but I think you've been at your best today, and I really appreciate that. And of the three that you've just gone through, just to remind people, we have the sense of inner congruity when you're at your best. You have the sense of wonder and the sense of losing oneself in the environment. One of those is Derren's kind of favourite, but actually I think they're all really important. But which one would you say Derren would choose? That's all you have to do. And I just want to say thanks, Derren. And you've been lovely. And it's a really, I was really genuinely looking forward to finding out your answers. And you haven't disappointed.
Oh, it's really, as I'm sure everybody says, it's an interesting thing doing them. And it's even more interesting than talking about them and seeing what they awaken in yourself. So yeah, it's a really lovely thing. So thank you for asking me.
It's a pleasure. I'll speak to you soon. Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.